Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 25 May 2024. It is the 161st anniversary of the birth of Heinrich Rickert, who was born in Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland, on this date in 1863. A few days ago, I was reading Moritz Schlick's posthumously published Philosophy of Nature, and I found the following in the first section of the book. Quote, we have the universal quality and all-embracing character of natural science, which prevents it from being subordinated to or arranged alongside any one of the arts or cultural sciences, and hence also the unique philosophical significance of natural science. All philosophical progress in the past has arisen out of scientific knowledge and the investigation of scientific problems. It is a very grave mistake, a mistake which has been made for the first time during the last 100 years, to believe that the arts and cultural sciences are in any way equivalent to natural science, or that they are, from the standpoint of philosophy, equally productive, unquote. And the editors have this note to this passage, a footnote or endnote, I should say. These sentences, as Schlick himself explained in details in his lectures, are directed against views similar to those of Heinrich Rickert, also expressed in his book, The Limits of Concept Formation in Natural Science, unquote. Schlick was really in the thick of things when it came to the foundations of logical empiricism about 100 years ago in Central Europe. He was a student of Max Planck and a friend of Einstein and David Hilbert. He did his dissertation under Max Planck, writing about light in 1904, so a year before Einstein's Annus Mirabilis. And then when the theory of relativity was new, he wrote significant philosophical expositions of relativity. And then when Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus came out, he was instrumental in spreading the doctrines of that book. He was one of the founders. He was one of the founders, if not the central founders, of the Vienna Circle, which started basically as a Wittgenstein reading club. They went through the Tractatus and read it line by line and discussed it. Although their vision of what Wittgenstein was doing was quite different from Wittgenstein himself. But all this is to say that Schlick was in the thick of trying to keep contemporary philosophy up to date with the rapid changes that were happening to science in his day. But Schlick was almost 20 years younger than Rickert, but he died in the same year when he was shot by a deranged student at the university. So we could say with some justification that Rickert and Schlick were philosophical contemporaries, though they belonged to different philosophical worlds. And that Schlick wanted to define himself in opposition to Rickert. Interesting, and it tells us something about the scholarly milieu in which Rickert's work was received. And I wanted to start out with Schlick as a contrast to Rickert, as Rickert is usually mentioned only in conjunction with people like Dilthey and Windelband, who shared many of his methodological views and whose work he continued and expanded. Rickert studied under Windelband, and he followed Windelband as professor of philosophy at Heidelberg when Windelband left. And interestingly, Heidegger was Rickert's assistant for some time, and Heidegger did his habilitation thesis under Rickert. In my recent episode on Wilhelm Windelband, I discussed his distinction between the nomothetic or law-like sciences and the idiographic or particularistic sciences. This distinction was subsequently taken up by other philosophers of history, continues to be used to this day. Dilthey reacted against Windelband, although he was, you could say, on the same page philosophically, while Rickert tried to build upon Windelband's distinction. So both were unsatisfied with the distinction as Windelband originally formulated it, but the distinction was definitely a stimulus to further thought. This cluster of Neo-Kantian thinkers, sometimes called the Baden School, is associated with efforts to formulate a rigorous method for history and for the historical sciences more generally, distinct from the methods of the empirical sciences. And this attempt to formulate a distinct method for history is connected to the ancient problem of whether or not history is a science. Even if we answer in the affirmative that history is indeed a science, there follows the further question of what kind of science history is. If we hold that science is one and universal, then the idea that there are multiple forms of scientific method doesn't make any sense at all. On the other hand, if we allow that there are many ways to pursue scientific knowledge, then this opens up the can of worms, suggesting that science is not one but many. And into this mix of Neo-Kantians and theorists of scientific methodology, we can further throw in Max Weber, one of the founding figures of sociology. So Weber was not a philosopher of history, but he was profoundly influenced by both philosophy and history. And his famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in particular, has influenced a lot of interpretations of modern history. There is a book-length study about Weber's conception of history, Max Weber's Vision of History, Ethics and Methods, by Gunther Roth and Wolfgang Schlick, which concludes with this paragraph. Quote, Weber's philosophy of history was pragmatic rather than pessimistic. Unless we save ourselves, nothing and nobody will save us. Historical knowledge, which comprises the levels of analysis discussed here, is necessary for self-clarification, for deciding what we want and where to go. But that knowledge cannot lead to the kind of science of society that would unlock the secrets of history and provide a master key to the future, unquote. So Weber, too, had something like a philosophy of history, and we shouldn't be surprised by this since Weber read Rickert's book, The Limits of Concept Formation in Natural Science, A Logical Introduction to the Human Sciences, and this significantly influenced Weber. Guy Oakes, in his introduction to his translation of Rickert's book, mentions that Weber had read Rickert in 1902, and he praised the book. Oakes also notes in his book about the two, Weber and Rickert, Concept Formation in the Cultural Sciences, the reliance of Weber on Rickert's work. And this is from Oakes, quote, much of the philosophical vocabulary of Weber's methodological writings is borrowed from Rickert. The concepts of the irrationality of reality, the hiatus irrationalis between concept and reality, the historical individual, the value relevance, for example, are all drawn from Rickert's work. In addition, Weber frequently relies upon lines of argument that seem to reproduce strategies employed in Rickert's writings. Weber's critique of positivism, his method of demarcating the cultural sciences from the natural sciences, his distinction between value relevance and value judgments, and his conception of methodology as a theory of concept formation all appear to be based on arguments that are more fully developed in Rickert's work. Finally, when Weber judges that a systematic statement of his own position is necessary, or when he sets out a position without developing the arguments required for its support, he regularly refers the reader to Rickert, unquote. So while Weber famously held that scientific knowledge is value-free, Rickert can be understood, one way of understanding Rickert is that he is anticipating virtue epistemology as values are central to his exposition of historical knowledge. It's central to Rickert's epistemology, you could say. In the following passage, Rickert shows how he can affirm both Weber's conception of the natural sciences as value-free and the historical sciences being about values by employing value itself as this distinction between two kinds of object of scientific knowledge. Quote, values always attach to cultural objects. Therefore, we shall call them goods in order to distinguish them as valuable entities from the values as such, which, considered in themselves, are not real at all and can be disregarded. Science does not conceive of the objects of nature as goods. On the contrary, it views them as devoid of value and without relevance to it. If we abstract from every value from our conception of a cultural object, we can say that it thereby becomes the same as a mere object of nature, or that it can be scientifically treated as such. The presence or absence of relevance to values can thus serve as a reliable criterion for distinguishing between two kinds of scientific objects. Indeed, in the interest of methodology, this is the only criterion we can employ here, because apart from the value attaching to it, every real cultural phenomenon must be capable of being regarded as connected with nature, and even as a part of nature. It will be shown later to what extent relevance to values is the determining factor in the logical structure of the historical sciences that deal with cultural phenomena, unquote. That is from Rickert's essay, Nature and Culture, which is included in a volume of English translations of his shorter works, Science and History, a Critique of Positivist Epistemology. An illuminating summary of some of the themes of Rickert's main work can be found in Victor Cupriano's paper, Teleology as a Method of Historical Cognition in Rickert's Philosophy. So this is from Cupriano. Quote, "The twofold aim Heinrich Rickert sets himself in his main work, The Limits of Concept Formation in Natural Science, is both to delimit naturalistic point of view, pretending to universal methodological meaning for cognition, and to identify the essence of historical sciences themselves. The first task implies the second one, as only after defining the limits of natural science can we find a place for history. Natural sciences, as Rickert puts it, suggest that their methods are universal, and any scientific research can only prove its scientificity with reference to the idea of natural science. The approach is in the idea that scientificity is universal for all types of research, and it coincides with natural science. The only way to form historical investigations is to apply the approach common to all sciences and elaborated by naturalists in details to the scientific specific subject of historical research. There is no difference in history and natural science except in their subject. Both history and natural science have common principles. For Rickert, this was the result of extrapolation of the naturalistic worldview on all manifestations of life. It is well known that he considered this point of view to be fallacious and opposed it. The core of his argument lies in the theory of concept formation. He had found new types of concept and based historical sciences on them. He characterized his type of concept formation as teleological. He wrote, "We can characterize it, the unity of the historical individual, as the teleological unity and individuals as teleological individuals. But as the historical concept formation has to be fixed to this teleological formation of individuals, we shall also call its principle teleological and shall distinguish historical concept formation from natural science, one as of teleological concept formation," unquote. So Rickert's book, The Limits of Concept Formation in Natural Science, A Logical Introduction to the Historical Sciences, which is so far available only as an abridgment in its English language edition, is a very tightly and continuously argued book. Like Darwin said of the Origin of Species, it's one long argument. And that means there's a lot to be learned from it, but it also poses a kind of challenge to the reader and for its acceptance in the wider philosophical community, because it's difficult to take out just one short section from it or one argument from the larger argument. You have to deal with the whole thing. And Rickert's influence in Anglo-American philosophy of history is almost non-existent. And I think at least one of the reasons for this is the challenge that the book presents by presenting one long argument. It's easier just to ignore the whole thing than to take the trouble to refute it. And I'm not saying that no one could counter Rickert's arguments, but despite Schlick's explicit criticism of Rickert, which the editors of Schlick's book said was more detailed in Schlick's lectures, and I haven't been able to find those lectures in English, I don't know of any detailed critique of Rickert in Anglophone philosophy of history. Louis O. Mink, who is a somewhat well-known philosopher of history, cites Rickert just in passing and offers a brusque criticism of the core ideas that Rickert developed, saying that historical uniqueness, quote, has been the basis of attempts, notably by Windelband and Rickert, to define history as knowledge of the concrete and the particular rather than the abstract and general. But the proto-science view can cogently argue that this will not serve to distinguish history from science because no two physical events are exactly identical either. And moreover, a physical fact is just as concrete and particular as an historical fact, unquote. For Mink, proto-science is a body of knowledge that has not yet achieved scientific status. And he argues that history is a proto-science that has yet to conform to the paradigm of the natural sciences. So in other words, history isn't a different kind of science, as Rickert maintains, only a body of knowledge that has not yet been made scientific. So Mink is aware of the issues raised by Rickert, but he doesn't feel the obligation to engage more deeply with Rickert's argument. There are a handful of English language books on the philosophy of history that build on Rickert's work, but I don't find him cited very often outside of this circle of direct influence. And this is unfortunate, since Rickert has a lot to contribute to debates specific to the concerns of Anglophone philosophy of history. For example, Collingwood is one of the most influential English language philosophers of history, and a full generation prior to Collingwood's work, Rickert preemptively criticized one of the central themes of Collingwood, namely that history is the reenactment of the thoughts of past historical actors. Pages 165 to 175 of the English language translation of Rickert are a discussion of what Rickert calls recreation that is relevant to Collingwood's conception of reenactment. And on this, Rickert has to say, quote, as regards the meaning of the mental life of other persons, we may perhaps acquire direct access to the individuality of its non-real meaning, but never to the individuality of its real existence, unquote. So what does this mean for Collingwood? Is reenactment possible or impossible, according to Rickert? Because Rickert's book is one long argument, to appreciate the relevance of his remarks on recreation to Collingwood, we can't deal with any one quote such as I just gave in isolation. A fuller exposition of the whole argument is necessary to get at, for example, Rickert's conception of non-real meaning. The core of Rickert's argument in the limits of concept formation and natural science is already evident from the title of the book. The concepts of natural science are limited by the individual and the particular. That is, they come up against that limit, and they have to fall short of it. Rickert emphasizes that his is a logical inquiry into the nature of the concepts of natural science and history, and he develops it in this way. Quote, what is it that fixes the limits of concept formation in natural science? Limits that, for logical or formal reasons, the natural sciences can never traverse. This is our first question, even though it need not remain our only question. In order to formulate propositions in natural science, especially laws of nature, we have to limit our concepts to what we could call generic. Quote, we have access to the full content of reality only through the immediacy of life, never by means of the concepts of natural science. The circumstance that the word reality can also be the name for the form that we describe to the immediately experienced perceptual and individual content is of no significance in this context. We designate as real the content that is both individual and also an object of sense perception. Thus it is clear that all the claims that could be made about the relations of natural scientific concept formation to concrete concrete actuality and individuality must also hold true for its relationship to empirical reality itself. The more completely we developed our natural scientific theories and representations, the further we depart from reality as unique, perceptual, and individual, unquote. So the concepts necessary to history are to be found on the other side of this limitation that's imposed by the individual on the concepts of natural science. Quote, when the concept is formed on the basis of a single individual reality, however, the historical concept includes precisely what distinguishes the different individuals from one another. Either it completely disregards what is common to them, or it retains this only insofar as it is indispensable to the definition of their individuality. Thus, we meet a kind of conceptualization in which the content of science does not become increasingly remote from the individuality of reality, which was the case for the sort of simplification produced by concepts of nature. On the contrary, by its means, the content of science is formed in such a way that it expresses the individuality, even if not the perceptuality, of empirical science. And on the next page, quote, insofar as the unity of the historical individual is always based on a value relation, it can be called a teleological unity, and historical individuals can be called teleological individuals. This is connected with the consideration that the concept of purpose is conceived as the concept of a future good that is to be realized. In other words, it is linked with the concept of value that is attached to it. In consequence, we generally call every way of thinking in which values play a decisive role teleological. In that case, concept formation in history, which has to conform to this sort of teleological formation of individuals, can also be seen as teleological. Accordingly, concept formations in history can be distinguished from those of natural science as teleological concept formations, unquote. So the concepts employed in history are not only individual in particular, they are also value-laden. And Rickert formulates that value-laden character of the concepts of history as teleological. So at this point, we can see how surprising it is that Rickert influenced Weber, who was the great advocate of value-free science. But I quoted a bit earlier from Rickert from one of his essays that shows how he keeps those two separate from each other. For Rickert, the concepts employed by history are characterized by their value component, and this, as much as their uniqueness, individuality, and particularity, marks them out as being logically distinct from the concepts of natural science. Rickert presents us with a picture of scientific inquiry as approaching the barrier of individuality from the side of natural science. And on the other side of this barrier, we find the historical sciences. The totality of scientific inquiry, then, has this chasm between the two modes of inquiry proper to the natural sciences and to the historical sciences. So when and where the nomothetic and the idiographic sciences meet, do they join up seamlessly, like a piece of joinery, so you can't barely see the gap between them? Or is there a gap between them? And if there is a gap between the nomothetic and the idiographic, what would we find in that gap? And what kind of concept formation would be necessary to make an inquiry into the point of transition from the natural to the historical sciences? So I think there's an opportunity there where we have this gap between the two. The science is in one sense continuous, but it's also in another sense discontinuous. So the whole range of knowledge is covered by some kind of scientific inquiry or another. But there's this sudden gap between the two. And in that point of transition, I think there might be opportunities in which we could bring to bear both the resources of Rickert's thought and the wider resources of Anglo-American analytical philosophy. So happy birthday, Heinrich Rickert, and thanks for listening.